Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to this jointly hosted event with the Heritage Foundation and the Claremont Institute. We're just a year into the Trump presidency. So at the one-year mark, you'd think that people who professionally analyze politics, journalists, political scientists, would have conducted competent evaluations of how the president has executed his constitutional duties. Since the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed, there's much to discuss, given that President Trump has taken away from the paths of his predecessors and given the boldness of his many policies. Besides controversial boldness, in many ways, President Trump has also been a rather conventional Republican president, rolling back regulations, dealing with the administrative state, appointing justices, trying to work with Congress on legislation. But if you're looking for such an evaluation, you'd be lost in the hurly-burly of hysteria surrounding Trump the man, what Trump tweeted, or what he may have implied. Here are three editorial titles that nicely encapsulate the tone of the public square today. Everyone in Trump world knows he's an idiot. Odds are Russia owns Trump. Is it time to call Trump mentally ill? This isn't from The Onion, it's from the New York Times. The press, in encouraging or inciting fanatical hatred, does a disservice to the public. As originally conceived, the press's aim was to bolster public reason and enlightenment, but one fears it does the opposite. One may even suspect that what seems like moral righteousness in the press may in fact be hatred on account of the challenge to their dominance over public opinion. Their freedom to abuse the public mind causes their pride to grow and distorts their judgment further. Given this poisoned public atmosphere, tonight we'd like to take a step away from Trump the man, Trump the tweeter, or Trump-related gossip, and look at Trump the executive, wielding executive powers. At the one-year mark, what has the president done in terms of executing his constitutional duties? We have assembled a top-notch panel today to try and tackle this. Ryan Williams, the president of the Claremont Institute, will be our moderator tonight, and he'll field questions. Speaking first on law enforcement and immigration is John Fonte, who is a senior fellow and director of the Center for American Common Culture at the Hudson Institute. And he's also the author of the book called Sovereignty or Submission: Will Americans Rule Themselves or Be Ruled by Others? Speaking next on the regulatory state will be Adam White, research fellow at the Hoover Institution and director of the Center for the Study of Administrative State, George Mason University's Antonin Scalia School of Law. And last, we have Professor Charles Kessler, who will speak on the president's use of the Bully Pulpit. Charles Kessler is a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute and editor of the Claremont Review of Books. He's also the Dengler Dykema Distinguished Professor of Government at the Claremont McKenna College and author of I Am the Change, Barack Obama, and the Crisis of Liberalism. John, take it away. Thank you.
I'm going to talk about President Trump and immigration policy. We could view immigration policy three ways: through the lens of a citizen, the lens of a client, or the lens of a consumer. There is the small r Republican view of immigration through the lens of citizenship. Progressives view immigration through the lens of identity politics. What matters most is not an individual's citizenship, but one's race, ethnicity, and gender. In this framework, there are clients and there are service providers. The overarching framework is the administrative state. Third, for some Cato libertarians, what matters is not whether one is a citizen or a client, but the consumer. For them, the transnational consumer in the global marketplace is superior to the right of a free people to rule themselves by determining, for example, their own immigration policy. Immigration enforcement by the Trump administration is an example of Republican government, small r. It's based on the principle of sovereignty of the people. Those core principles of sovereignty and consent are directly challenged by two forces in America today, by progressives and by some libertarians. On the transnational progressive left, Nancy Pelosi makes a clear case for open borders. Quote, she says, "We are all Americans, north and south in this hemisphere. This is a community with a border running through it." So much for citizenship. Libertarian Alex Narasta at the Cato Institute declares, "America's core founding principle is the Enlightenment theory of natural rights. Freedom of movement is indispensable to the full use of those rights. To restrict an immigrant's ability to move to the United States not only infringes upon his natural rights, but also upon the natural rights of Americans who want to hire the immigrant." Tom West, in The Political Theory of the American Founding, explains that the Cato approach violates the core principle of government by consent of the governed. Here's West. Quote, "Since citizenship is the effect of a compact, there is no right to immigrate unless there is consent on both sides," unquote. In other words, illegal immigrants are here without the consent of the people. Well, let's just jump into the weeds on immigration. What we see is a unitary executive in action with DHS Secretary Nielsen, Acting Director of ICE, that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Tom Holman, the Attorney General Jeff Sessions, Chief of Staff John Kelly, and the President, all on the same page on immigration. Trump's first year saw an increase by 25% in interior enforcement, which had plunged to a 10-year low in Obama's last year. ICE is going into sanctuary jurisdictions. Acting Director of ICE, Tom Holman, said if he, Jerry Brown, quote, thinks ICE is going away, we're not. As a matter of fact, we're going to increase our enforcement presence in California. In December and January, ICE conducted raids in California, in New York City, Chicago, New Jersey, arresting criminal aliens. In New Jersey, 80% of them had prior felony convictions. Now, some argue that sanctuary policies are needed so that immigrants will not be afraid and come forward and report crimes and so on. This myth has no basis in reality. A 2009 analysis by the University of Virginia found no decline in crime reporting after the implementation of tough enforcement programming. This is an immigrant community. Consider the example of Prince George's County in Maryland. It's about 10 miles from here. It's been a sanctuary county since October 2014. Since that time, as the Washington Post reported, because of MS-13, people live in fear. Gang control over local businesses is enforced through extortion and intimidation daily. The rebirth of the once defunct MS-13 in the United States was fueled by fresh recruits from a massive wave of almost 200,000 unaccompanied minors, so-called, from Central America. This wave was facilitated by the Obama administration that gave asylum to boys 16, 17, and older, no reliable proof of age, and placed them many times with illegal immigrant relatives, where they are often recruited by MS-13. The Trump administration has cracked down on MS-13. ICE has conducted Operation Raging Bull from September to November 2017 and arrested hundreds of MS-13 gang members in secessionist, sanctuary jurisdictions. These crimes include murder, kidnapping, sex trafficking, drug trafficking, assassinations, extortion, and blackmail. The Justice Department under Jeff Sessions has demanded documents and threatened subpoenas for 23 sanctuary jurisdictions under the 1996 immigration law. Justice has threatened to recoup funds previously given out and cut off future grant money to 23 jurisdictions, which include Chicago, Cook County, New York City, Denver, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Louisville, Kentucky, Jackson, Mississippi, and the 3 states of California, Illinois, and Oregon. The Department of Justice under Sessions is also re-examining the policy of administrative closure, which many considered a backdoor amnesty by the Obama administration. There are 350,000 closed cases in administrative closure. These are illegal aliens that could be deported. Cases are just closed. Supposedly to fight backlogs, but it turns out backlogs have increased. There are 658,000 backlog cases. So it's over 1 million people with immigration violations that Attorney General Sessions is now reviewing to see what categories might be reopened. In addition, he's hiring additional immigration judges that work for the Justice Department, the Bureau of Immigration Appeal. Well, let's go into the weeds and just look at one example of vetting people coming to this country. Let's take the K-1 fiancé visa. Remember the woman involved in the mass murder terrorist attack in San Bernardino, California, was admitted to the United States under the K-1 visa. There are two steps in a K-1 visa. First step is a petition by an American citizen for his alien fiancée to the Immigration Service. This is supposed to include face-to-face interviews. This process of face-to-face interviews was often skipped during the Obama administration. Obama administration approved 90.5% of this first step. That was in the last year of Obama. First year of Trump, it's down from 90% to 66.2%. There's a lot of fraud in this program. And they started having actual interviews with people. So that's the first step. Second step, the alien fiancé is interviewed at a U.S. State Department consular office. This step was, after the first step's already been approved. Under Obama's last year, 99% approval. Under Trump, first year, there's a increase of denials of 20%. There has been, as I say, a lot of fraud and poor vetting on this program, so that's being cleaned up. Another program, an office created by executive order of the president called VOICE, Victims of Immigration Crime Engagement, VOICE. It's created by executive order to assist victims of illegal immigrant crime. Some conservatives at National Review wrote that VOICE would serve no good purpose, quote. Actually, the office serves several good purposes. The creation of VOICE is a challenge to the sanctuary jurisdictions that protect criminal aliens and then release them into the general population, where they're free to commit even more crimes against Americans. Kate Steinle's murder, for example, in San Francisco, had illegally entered the United States over 6 times. He was deported 5 times, and he served over a year in various prisons on the West Coast for numerous felony convictions. We need to delegitimize the entire sanctuary secessionist movement. The center of gravity in this political war over immigration enforcement is really the occupation of the moral high ground, the grand narrative that explains the immigration story to the public. The creation of VOICE is one instrument among others that should be used to seize the offensive in fighting for an immigration policy that serves first and foremost the American people. In conclusion, I want to say that almost all of President Trump's administrative immigration enforcement measures, almost all of them, have been fought tooth and nail by progressives, by some libertarians, and by elements of the administrative state, particularly the lawless judiciary. Never doubt for a moment that on this issue, progressives and many libertarians are allies, and in both of them are major adversaries of the immigration law enforcement and thus of democratic sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks especially, thank you very much to the Claremont Institute and my friends at the Federal Society. I speak to many Federal Society events. Thank you very much to my friends at the Claremont Institute and the Heritage Foundation for inviting me today. It's a special privilege to be on this stage. Heritage does so much important work on regulatory reform. Some folks in the audience today, Diane Katz and Paul Larkin, who do important things that you ought to read, and it's a real honor and privilege to be able to share their stage for a moment to offer a few thoughts on the administrative state and President Trump's attempts to reform it. So the second year of a presidential administration is an important inflection point for reforming regulations and reining in the administrative state. Since it's a Claremont event, I feel safe quoting Winston Churchill. To borrow a line from Churchill, the start of year 2 is, quote, not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. And at this point, I think we can safely say the Trump administration is off to a great start on many of the major reforms of administrative regulatory excess that defined the Obama administration. But at this point, I think we can also ascertain a danger in President Trump's own excess, a danger both in principle and in practice, by which I mean if President Trump wants to succeed in reforming the administrative state for the long run, then I hope he will significantly change his own use of the bully pulpit to help further that aim. So let's start with the administration's good start. Recently, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs reported that the administration has already either stopped or delayed nearly 1,600 proposed or pending regulatory action. That's on top of the 15 major regulations that the administration has already rolled back, perhaps permanently, through use of the Congressional Review Act. And in addition to that, all of the myriad reform efforts being undertaken by the agencies, the individual agency level through the notice and comment process. It's an amazing start. Now, in the aftermath of President Obama's administration, perhaps any Republican administration would have undertaken at least some regulatory reforms. But President Trump and this White House put an unprecedented emphasis on the use of executive orders as a tool for energizing and steering the reform process. And of all the things I could focus on in terms of success so far in this administration, I think that's the point that really merits the most attention, that use of executive orders as a tool for executive energy. Instead of waiting for agencies to identify and pursue the right priorities, President Trump issued executive orders, setting the agency's agendas from the top. Now, to be clear, there are limits on what a president can obtain lawfully through executive orders. He can't order agencies to ignore lawful statutes, but when statutes afford agencies broad discretion, as they almost always do, then the president can use executive orders to further direct and channel the agency's use of that discretion. And that is precisely what President Trump did in at least two important ways. First, he issued Executive Order 13777, requiring agencies to repeal 2 old rules for every new one, and capping the total costs that agencies can impose on society. Now, presidents dating back to Reagan have used across-the-board executive orders to oversee and channel the agency process, but this executive order and these particular tools were new, and I think an important and welcome innovation in redoubling the White House efforts to oversee, manage, and limit the regulatory process across all executive agencies. Because it's a new approach, especially in the federal government, it will take some ironing out in practice, but it's an innovative and important development. Second, in addition to that across-the-board executive order, President Trump issued many executive orders targeting specific agencies or policies for reform. In Executive Order 13772, he announced new core principles for financial reform for financial regulators to vindicate. In Executive Order 13783, he announced new policies for energy independence and economic growth to be pursued first and foremost by the EPA's reform of Obama's unlawful and excessive Clean Power Plan. These are just 2 of several examples I could offer of executive orders that exemplify the administration's energetic approach to regulatory reform. And energetic is the key word, because I think these executive orders exemplify Alexander Hamilton's view of executive power and good government. As he famously explained in Federalist 70, quote, "Energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government." And while we usually recall Hamilton's appeal in terms of national security, Hamilton stressed the importance of an energetic executive in domestic governance as well. So President Trump's executive orders so far are a good and important example of a president energetically leading the executive branch, the administrative apparatus, and conveying energy to his agency leadership. Furthermore, these orders promote transparency and accountability. After all, they're signed by the president. The president is expressly endorsing and directing these policies. And so accountability flows all the way up to the top and not just getting trapped in the bureaucratic apparatus. These policies are connected to the president himself, and in our constitutional system, that's a good thing. Now, his agencies will need that energy in the days and years to come when his administration's regulatory reforms will face immense challenges in the courts, in the court of public opinion, and even within the agencies themselves, thanks to the so-called self-styled resistance movement. And frankly, as we enter this stage of the process, I think President Trump's own rhetoric will make the work of reform harder, not easier, to complete. Consider this. Last year, federal agencies began myriad notice and comment proceedings to undo Obama agency regulations. This year, the notice and comment process in lots of those cases will end. The agencies will complete their process and the matter will turn to court, where parties will challenge those policies before skeptical judges. Now, judges are supposed to be fairly deferential to the agency's conclusions, but that traditional deferential approach presumes a fair amount of expertise and reasonableness on the part of the executive branch. How deferential will judges be to Trump's agencies, at least on significant or controversial policies? I think last year's immigration reform lawsuits, which John just referred to a moment ago, may be a forebear, a harbinger of what's to come in terms of the judges scrutinizing the agencies with extra skepticism, given how the president conducts himself in public and how he himself talks about the policies, the aims that his administration is pursuing. Now, that is a short-term concern. Here's a much more significant and longer-term concern. Genuinely sustainable long-term regulatory reform requires serious legislation. This is a generational project, of course, but there is at least some cause for hope in the future. In the Senate, for example, a bipartisan coalition of senators introduced major reforms to the Administrative Procedure Act, the 70-year-old body of law that governs us. Senators Portman and Hatch were joined by Heitkamp and Manchin for serious reforms to the APA. But to actually enact reforms to the APA, let alone reforms to substantive laws like the Clean Air Act, will require sustained legislative dialogue and bipartisanship. Does President Trump's use of the bully pulpit make this long-term bipartisan dialogue more likely to succeed or less? Now, President Trump did not create our political divisions, but he is exacerbating them through his singular use of the bully pulpit. Where Teddy Roosevelt coined the phrase bully pulpit to describe his use of the White House as a pulpit for preaching his agenda, President Trump's pronouncements are serving much different ends to much different effect. This is regrettable as a matter of constitutional principle, but it's also counterproductive as a matter of his administration's own agenda. The better approach is one exemplified by the president whose birthday we mark today. In his first inaugural address, George Washington stressed that, quote, "The foundation of our national policy will be laid in the pure and immutable principles of private morality, and the preeminence of free government will be exemplified by all the attributes which can win the affections of its citizens and command the respect of the world." As with so many things, President Washington was right. An American president should promote Republican virtue and the public good, not detract from it. And the White House should be a bully pulpit for winning the affection of our citizens and commanding the respect of the world. I hope President Trump will begin to do so for the good of his country and for the good of his own administration's important reforms to the administrative state. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's it's a lovely occasion, and I'm very happy to be here. And I wanted to especially thank Arthur Millick, who has put together this interesting panel. My focus is not on executive power or the administrative state, those have been covered, but the bully pulpit. And I should begin by distinguishing that subject from the pulpit, the bully in the pulpit, which is, I think, the way a lot of people in Washington look at Donald Trump in general, and especially Trump's rhetoric. But what I thought I would do actually was, in a very a quick and preliminary way, say something about the specific character of President Trump's use of the bully pulpit in terms of classical rhetorical analysis. Those of you who have encountered Aristotle's rhetoric, perhaps long ago in some classroom, may recall that there are three characteristics that oratory, and especially political speech really of almost any kind, exhibits. Three characteristics, and Aristotle called these ethos, pathos, and logos. Three forms of proof, really, that an orator or a political rhetorician uses every time he attempts to influence an audience. The first ethos is ethical proof, meaning what is the character of the speaker? What does the audience think about the speaker? And how does he use the audience's perception of his character to help him in his persuasive endeavor? Rhetoric, political speech is always about more than the argument. It's about the character of the person making the argument. Is he believable? Does he reach you? And that leads to the second characteristic, pathos or passion. What passions in the audience does the speaker appeal to? How does he attempt to play upon and to win the audience's trust in him and to move their emotions in the direction of his argument? And argument, logos, reason is the third characteristic. So you've got the sort of the proof from character, the proof from the passions, and the proof from reason. So as I say, something very briefly about each of these in connection to President Trump. So first, I would say, although I'm risking many generalizations here, that the leading element in the ethical presentation of Trump, you might say, how does he present himself ethically, is a form of courage. As a speaker, he starts from and returns to a sense of courage in defense of one's own. Other speakers obviously start from a different sort of ethical reputation. Courage in defense of one's own doesn't require that one be perfect or ethically high-minded necessarily. And in a certain respect, therefore, it's very suitable for President Trump's political speech because he has a problem on the front of ordinary ethics and morality. If you don't believe me, read any Never Trumper. Since for 2 years, the Never Trumpers have poured invective on the very bad character of Mr. Trump for very many reasons. But after 2 years, I don't think they have really advanced our understanding of Mr. Trump, his agenda, his talents, or our understanding of the political situation of the country. But they have produced a very large pile of invective, which is getting larger every day. The amazing thing is how comparatively ineffective this argument has been. It has been repeated again and again and again on the left, on the right, on television, in editorial columns. Mr. Trump is a very bad man. He's a liar. I don't need to go into the specifics. You know what they are. He's accused of many vices and many sins. But the amazing thing is, to me, that these arguments have not really inhibited his believability in the political sense. They have not prevented him from winning political victories, impressive political victories in the past year. And they have not proved the trump card that his opponents have thought they would prove, although it certainly is their long suit, these kinds of arguments. On the contrary, and precisely because he takes his stand in a way on a certain kind of assertiveness, a certain kind of courage, these things are less important to his audacity and to, if I may use an Obama word, to his assertiveness than they would be if he were starting from a different point of view. Some examples of what I mean by courage in this particular way. One of the peculiarities of Trump's rhetoric is that he lacks almost completely the typical Republican guilty conscience on the question of race and civil rights. It is really quite amazing. He is almost alone in this. Virtually every other Republican, virtually any of the 16 other candidates who ran against him, had a very typical Republican point of view on the question of civil rights and race, which is they feel guilty about their party's, Southern strategy, their party's complicity in resisting affirmative action and various other kinds of things. There is, as far as I can tell, nothing of that in Mr. Trump. He's much closer, let us say, to the position of Clarence Thomas, than he is to on this question of race and racial remedies than he is to the position of Jeb Bush or any other major Republican contender who might come to mind. He doesn't. It's not as important in a way for his own arguments as it is obviously for Clarence Thomas, but I think it is still quite remarkable. Also, the kind of courage that, more specifically, that he represents is associated in a way with his reputation as a builder. And he calls himself a builder. He calls America a nation of builders. He's many things besides that. I mean, he knows his way around a construction site. He also knows his way around a TV studio. His career has included things other than being a landlord or a builder, but still, that is where he comes home. That is how he chooses to present himself. And he associates himself, you might say, almost perhaps involuntarily with a certain kind of brazen, masculine, assertive ethics that comes with that job, the job of a builder. He gets things done. He's impatient with words or mere verbiage. He will build a beautiful building. He will build it, but he will build it quickly, and he will build it profitably. And you can count on that. So I would say one could go on and flesh this out, and the question of courage radiates, but enough for that. On the question of pathos, or what is the passion to which he appeals in the audience, I think the clue here really is the term greatness. Make America great again. His appeal to the passion skews to the noble, let's say. He doesn't neglect justice, which is the fundamental political passion, but his heart seems to be more in the noble than in justice as such. He certainly is capable of attacking the injustice of a political establishment, for example, that has monopolized money and income streams in America and for the last 20 years or so. But he's in a way more eloquent and more naturally, I think, persuasive when the subject is the adjoining one of the way they have attempted to monopolize honor, the way they look down on the white working class, the way they look down on the poorly educated. Remember this during the campaign? He said at one point, looking at poll results, "I love the poorly educated." Something no other Republican candidate would ever say. And so this disdain for the disdainers, this defense of popular honor against the experts and the ruling class, you might say, gives him a very keen nose for unearned success and for liberal hypocrisy, which is a very important arrow in his quiver. I mention only one word, Pocahontas. Final thing, on this question of logos, or the actual argument that is typical of, so far at least, of President Trump. There's, as a non-politician and as very much an amateur in the field of politics, Trump is in some ways a little logos light. He's not, he doesn't have historical examples. He doesn't have a kind of a ready set of comparisons like most political speakers and politicians would. He just hasn't thought like that. He hasn't read those things in his long earlier life. But still, if one could say that, whereas say Reagan's logos in a way went to the question of limited government and recovering limits on government. Trump's goes to the integrity of the nation, to being one people, a people that is worthy of love, being Americans first. And I think America first is in a way a distraction from the argument he's really making, because it is not essentially an isolationist argument, and it's not essentially a foreign policy argument. It's an argument from the nature of political life or political right, that a nation, that justice, like charity, ought to begin at home. And there's nothing, there's nothing radical about that. There's nothing new about that appeal, and yet, in the early 21st century, it comes across, I think, as strikingly courageous and different from the kind of political argument that one hears elsewhere. Essential to putting Americans first is putting the people's authority, their sovereignty, over that of the government, including that of the administrative state, and directing executive power on their behalf to their ends. With that, I shall subside. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Charles, and thank you, Adam, and thank you, John, for your remarks. I also wanted to echo Charles and the rest of the panelists in thanking Arthur Millick, the Associate Director of the Simon Center here at Heritage, and thanking David Azarad, couldn't be here today, the Director, and thanking Heritage for graciously providing a space for this argument. This is one that the Claremont Institute is going to continue to have. We think the current trajectory and future trajectory of the Trump administration, the conservative movement, the Republican Party is a very important question. It's a question that gets to fundamental questions of the structure of our regime. And it's one really that goes back to a rolling crisis in American government that's at least 40 years old, I think, perhaps inaugurated by Reagan's breakup of the old liberal consensus, which before that was a progressive consensus, which wanted to reorient government away from the view from the founding of limited government, separation of powers, and most importantly for our topic today, I think, and political control of the branches of government, and to replace it with administrative rule, expert rule, the neutral science of government in its instantiation in an independent rather than a politically dependent branch of rulers. I think that's the central question, or many of us at Claremont think that's the central question that was at stake in this last election, so we want to continue to have this argument. And I think in a way, great disagreement over Trump helps stoke these fires, and I think and hope will continue to make this debate both passionate and high-minded. So that's the spirit of this panel today. I don't mean to pick on Adam, but I thought one thing that you said spoke directly to this larger context, and to the extent that I agree with John and Charles a little bit more, I just thought it might be a nice jumping-off point for us, after which point we can open it up for questions. But you said that President Trump did not create our current political divisions, but he is exacerbating them. And I think that's true, but I think maybe I might view it more positively than you do. So to the extent that our modern political parties, especially over this 40-year period, have sorted themselves ideologically into these two camps of which I spoke, the sort of progressive rule by expert on the one side, and then the return to limited government and popular control on the other. To the extent that we're at loggerheads on that question, which is a regime-level question, don't we need to heighten the contradictions, in the old Marxist phrase, continue the exacerbation, and then one of these parties has to win this argument definitively and advance for a generation or more on a project of reform? You brought up Washington, but don't forget Jefferson, who in the election of 1800 said, we're all Republicans, we're all Federalists, but what he meant was, we won, so really we're all Republicans now. And the Federalist Party, of course, was no more after that. So I throw that open for all three of our panelists.
Well, I'll grant the point that the principles that I'm glad to see this administration pursuing in terms of fundamentally reforming the administrative state, principles that I dedicate my work towards, principles that you and the Claremont Institute, all of us dedicate our work towards. Those are things on which you fundamentally cannot and must not compromise as a matter of constitutional principle. To the extent that the progressive project of the 20th century was fundamentally at loggerheads with that basic view of constitutionalism, American constitutionalism, to the extent progressivism was at odds with that, I think it was, then I agree. I think amplifying the differences between our approach and their approach and trying to rally the American public to our side rather than theirs is a noble cause. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. In the meantime, though, there are reforms that can happen, important reforms that can happen. Again, I singled out one in particular. It's not going to be enacted this year. It might not be enacted for years, but these fundamental reforms to the Administrative Procedure Act, that is something that can be achieved in a political lifetime. And it's something that I think we should strive towards. And I do not see that becoming more likely in light of the way the President Trump talks about his opponents, talks about other Americans. I mean, I could go on at length, and I don't want to belabor the point, but I do think it's important that the fight to reform American government, to bring it back to a structural constitution, it's fundamentally important. But I never thought that the moment at which we'd be seeing advances on that would be the exact same moment at which so many Republicans would be downplaying the importance of that other fundamental constitutional value, the one that the framers talked about in the Federalist Papers, while at the same time they're talking about structural constitutionalism. That's Republican virtue. The virtues that Madison said in Federalist 55, Republican government presupposes more than any other form of government. And so I really am uncomfortable with seeing that side of Republican government and American constitutionalism being downplayed in service of pursuing the structural constitution. I really don't want to let go of that fight.
John or Charles?
Okay. I think we all share the goal, what Adam is saying, is the return of the Constitution. Let's put it simply that way. The problem is that the progressive left is basically now dominant in most of the major institutions in our country. That would, we've discussed the administrative state, but besides the administrative state, think of what I like to think of as the cultural Leviathan. That's the mainstream media, the universities, the human rights departments of Fortune 500 countries, Silicon Valley, Hollywood, the mainline churches. The fact that George Washington's plaque was removed from Christ Church, where he went in Virginia, tells us something about our culture. So the conservative movement can't simply be talking about Republican virtue or taking these small steps. It has to, I think, and this is, since the left has taken over, all of these institutions by sort of a revolutionary means there has to be a rather vigorous, almost revolutionary opposition to this progressive project, to overthrow this progressive project. I like to think in terms of no political movement has succeeded without having both bad cops and good cops. In other words, those pushing, and that includes the American Revolution. We're talking about Washington and Adams, but there's also Tom Paine and Sam Adams, who without them, I don't think Washington and Adams would have succeeded. So the bad cops had to call in with the good cops. What you have now is a little strange situation. Usually the vice president is the bad cop, Nixon to Eisenhower, Agnew to Nixon, and so on. Here you have the president actually playing the bad cop role, but as Charles said, since no other Republicans wanted to do it, it had to be done by somebody.
I'd say, first of all, that I agree with almost everything Adam said. I don't think there's anyone who wouldn't like to reach for the edit button on the Twitter feed of the president, occasionally at least. But the other side, the reason why, where I would depart from you a little bit at least, is the other side of Republican virtue is Republican corruption. And the question now, I think, is how and to what extent Republican institutions, including constitutional ones, are corrupted. And the great example is Congress, it seems to me, or at least one of the first examples is Congress. The problem of the administrative state could not exist without Congress, which created the administrative state. It can't be solved without Congress. But Congress seems very comfortable with the administrative state. It enjoys a lot of benefits from the administrative state. It avoids a lot of pains and costs because of the administrative state. And it shows very, very little virtue in terms of a will to reform itself in order to return, in some sense, popular control of the government to the people through their Congress. And populism has always seemed to me, in a way, a word of limited usefulness in describing what's going on in our politics now. Because in the era of the administrative state, the people can do very little themselves directly. There are elections, but there's very little else that they can do. There are a few handles they can seize to change the government. The courts will stop them. I mean, we have many examples in California of conservative initiatives that passed using the techniques of direct democracy, only to be struck down by courts, federal courts or state courts, very activist courts. And many of the ways in which, a people could get control of its government again, I don't need to tell you this, are not available right now, or at least don't have much efficacy. And it would be very useful if the president would actually speak to that problem and put some pressure on Congress morally and intellectually on that point. And if he's looking for subjects for tweets, there's a huge subject there waiting for him.
Well, good. I think we have some time for questions.
This is for you, Dr. Kessler, and Adam, you might want to chime in as well. I know you're talking about President Trump's ethos and his form of courage and defense of his own, and how it's not really having an effect now, but do you think in the long term it might impact the midterms or maybe the next election? Because to me personally, it feels like we're at year 8 instead of year 1 or year 2. And I just don't know if maybe that is leading to like a start of exhaustion or something.
I understand your sentiment. I wrote many months ago now that the president risked inducing a state of nervous exhaustion in the country. And I think that is a danger. It's not a danger, it's a danger that proceeds from the peculiar way he exerts his courage, if you want to call it that, the kinds of fights he picks, many of which he can't win, but he can't win the fight, but he can get some benefit out of having the fight. But there's also a collateral cost to that, which is that the public is consumed perhaps more than it needs to be or ought to be by the day-to-day, controversies that the president sometimes unleashes, and I think that is a problem for him. On the other, there's in politics, every advantage has a disadvantage, and vice versa. And he's done reasonably well, I think, in the first year, very well in certain respects in his first year. So let's see what happens.
Charles referred to President Trump inducing a state of exhaustion. I jotted that down, and that's, I'm sure we all feel exhausted from time to time with the political maelstrom. But I looking ahead to the next election cycle, I wonder if he's not inducing something quite different. And actually, I think it'd be quite ironic. I think if anything, President Trump is inducing among his political opponents, his critics, well, to borrow a famous line from Michael Anton's article, right, a sense that they now face a Flight 93 election, And I think that he is giving to them, ironically, the same sense of doom that in many ways amplified his own political base. It's hard to imagine Democrats not seeing the next presidential election as their own Flight 93 election.
I think what he's doing is, what he's done successfully is to push the Overton window, the climate of opinion, that the Swedes call it the opinion corridor, issues that were never discussed before. In fact, the majority, getting back to immigration for a moment, a majority now favor limiting legal immigration, which would have been unheard of a couple years ago. It's the latest Harris Harvard poll. And this is basically due to President Trump, and it's this expansion of the Overton window. As far as exhaustion, everybody does, at some point, every president does exhaust himself with the public. But I think what's happened here, by moving the Overton window, I think he's made it impossible to go back to the McCains and the Romneys, Jeb Bush. I think now there's the situation is altered within the Republican Party.
Yes, sir. Wait for the microphone if you would.
This thing about exhaustion, it takes two to tango,
and the sense of hysterical overreaction to everything that the man does began before he was sworn into office. So I don't think it's fair to lay the sense of exhaustion entirely at the feet of the president.
No, and I wouldn't do that. It is, I mean, with it is the media that creates the moment here of exhaustion. But and without the existence of social media, we'd be having a very different kind of conversation about this. I mean, it's not all his fault, but he has exploited the technologies and the opportunities that have come to him in a very vigorous way to move the climate of opinion. But I will say that the test in the long run is he persuading people? I mean, you can move them because of immediate concerns, interests, fears, but are you changing the minds of your own party and then the majority of the country in the long run? And that is his challenge. That's his major challenge, I think, and that is very hard to measure, certainly this early in a term.
Yeah, in the back.
I just want to follow up on that question. When this is a bully pulpit, right? Doesn't it seem perhaps he's using it more to keep the media off guard and give voice to people who would have an opinion, who cannot have an opinion? Is that the purpose of the bully pulpit?
Well, as Adam said, the term is really an invention of Teddy Roosevelt, and he meant it to imply that the powers of the president are not limited to those actually specified in Article 2 of the Constitution, and that one of the most important powers he has is simply the power to fascinate the country and to concentrate the attention of the country on the moral message or the political message that he is delivering, and through that to move public opinion and thus the Congress. And that is what, since Woodrow Wilson, we have, and Teddy Roosevelt, we've called leadership. And that was originally, in a way, a critique of energy, a critique of the notion that the idea was there's not enough energy in the executive. The constitutional powers don't give him enough play in American politics. He wasn't, the president didn't used to be at the center of American politics in quite the way he has been ever since Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, basically, in the 20th century. And so there are some interesting constitutional implications or questions to be raised about the bully pulpit. But it is now, an accepted part of American political life, obviously, for liberals and conservatives and Democrats and Republicans.
I just wanted to add, the last real great reforms in service of rolling back the administrative state. The great structural reforms were early in the Reagan administration. President Reagan campaigned on the need for regulatory reform, easing regulatory burdens, making government more accountable. And in the very opening weeks of Reagan's first term, his task force created this new apparatus, this structure for White House oversight of agencies, OIRA. It was immensely controversial at the time, but the White House undertook a sustained campaign in support of their reforms. And furthermore, the White House undertook a sustained investment of resources in seeing those reforms succeed. There's a great article in the new issue of National Affairs, right alongside Arthur's great article in the new issue of National Affairs. There's the new one by Andrew Rudelovich from Bowdoin College, where he traces the history of these reforms through the Reagan administration and beyond. And the Reagan administration, by formulating sound reforms, by standing behind them rhetorically and investing political capital to see them succeed in the real world, managed to entrench major success in regulatory reform. So much so that when President Clinton was elected 12 years later and Democrats assumed he would roll it back, he didn't roll it back. He kept it, he sustained it. That's a great example of the bully pulpit in connection with the president's other constitutional powers succeeding in real reform. And that's the ideal that I hope the Trump administration pursues in the next 3 or 7 years of his administration.
Well, the presidential Twitter is obviously here to stay. There's not any future president's going to be using this, replacing the fireside chat and the television speech. It's certainly here for good now.
Time for one more.
It's a good argument for Calvin Coolidge, though.
Time for one more question here in the back, sir.
A few weeks ago, Bobby Jindal, the former governor of Louisiana, wrote in a Wall Street Journal article that Trump had saved the Republican Party by bringing back disaffected low and middle class blue-collar workers who traditionally had voted Democratic. Jindal went on to say that now, having saved the Republican Party, it was time for Trump to leave, but put that aside for a second. Who else in the Republican Party out there could now attract that same group of people that he has brought into the Republican Party? Was there anybody on the stage with him during the last debates that could pick up that mantle, or do Republicans have to look to a bench, in the minor leagues or someplace else, to try to find people who can continue to draw on that segment of the American population?
Well, in terms of policy, there's no question that Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas would be the most likely heir. I don't know about personnel, not necessarily personality, but certainly in policy, he would be the most likely person to carry on, and that's so in every policy he's involved with, whether it's immigration, whether it's certain part of foreign policy, whether on crime, for example, he's won law and order. He stood against the big effort on so-called criminal reform promoted by many folks on the center right, including the Koch Foundation. He stood against that, as has Jeff Sessions. Sessions was sort of a forerunner, I think, of the populist uprising that with President Trump's victory, and I think Cotton may be the future here.
I would say, it looked for a while as though there might be a series of primary challenges in 2018, and there still might be in 2020, from, the Steve Bannon right to try to move the party and especially the Senate in a Trumpist direction. I always thought that was a fantasy. And now I think, that there is no more Steve Bannon circle in Washington, or really, I'm not even sure there is in the party. Now I think it will come in a different way. People, if Trump is successful, he will have imitators. And the party will, rather than in a series of ideological confrontations, I think it more likely now that the process will be a sort of more peaceful and gradual one in which a new cohort of candidates will come forward, and out of that cohort would be potential competitors to Tom Cotton for the future presidential nominations.
Well, thank you all for coming, and join me in thanking the panelists. And join us for a reception to follow.